In the summer of 2017, Detective Chief Inspector Jane Lloyd stood before a room of seasoned investigators and said something that would haunt them for years. "This is the most prolific offender we have ever seen." She wasn't talking about a serial killer. She wasn't describing a terrorist. She was talking about a man who had never physically harmed anyone, yet had destroyed more lives than most murderers ever could. His weapon wasn't a knife or a gun, it was a keyboard. His hunting ground wasn't a back alley or abandoned building. It was the infinite, anonymous darkness of the internet. And for nearly 8 years, he operated with such calculated precision that investigators called him a ghost. By day, he taught students about the mysteries of the Earth's core. By night, he explored the darkest corners of human depravity. This is the story of how a Cambridge-educated academic became Britain's most prolific online predator, and how the very technology he used to destroy lives ultimately became the key to his downfall. I'm bringing you another case that shows how evil doesn't always wear the mask we expect. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, you know what to do. That subscribe button is right there. And trust me, after today's story, you'll want to be notified when we uncover the next case that'll keep you up at night. Cambridge, England. One of the world's most prestigious universities, where brilliant minds gather to push the boundaries of human knowledge. In the Department of Earth Sciences, Dr. Matthew Falder was considered exactly that, a brilliant mind. Born in 1989, Falder had followed what seemed like the perfect academic trajectory: a first-class degree, a PhD in geophysics, and by his mid-20s, he was already establishing himself as a respected researcher. His colleagues knew him as quiet, perhaps a bit awkward, but undeniably intelligent. To his students, he was Dr. Falder, the lecturer who could explain complex geological processes with remarkable clarity. To his peers, he was a promising young academic whose research into seismic imaging was genuinely groundbreaking. To his family, he was Matthew, a son they were proud of, a man who seemed to have found his calling in the pursuit of knowledge. But every evening, as the last student left his office and the university corridors grew quiet, Dr. Falder would go home to his computer. He would close his curtains, lock his door, and transform into someone else entirely. Someone his colleagues would never recognize. Someone his family would never believe existed. You see, Matthew Falder had been living a double life, so complete, so carefully constructed, that it would take an international investigation to uncover the truth. And that truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. While his academic colleagues were publishing papers about underground rock formations, Falder was navigating underground networks of an entirely different kind. The dark web, that hidden layer of the internet where anonymity reigns supreme, and the worst of humanity gathers to trade in misery. Here, he wasn't Dr. Falder, the respected academic. Here, he was in the garden, a username that would become synonymous with some of the most calculated cruelty ever documented in cybercrime history. And like any predator, he had perfected his hunting strategy. Falder's method was diabolically simple. He would create fake profiles, posing as a female photographer or modeling scout. The profiles were professional, convincing, complete with stolen portfolio images and fabricated credentials. To anyone scrolling through, they looked legitimate, even impressive. His targets? Young people with dreams, aspiring models, actors, artists, anyone who might be tempted by the promise of a professional photo shoot or modeling opportunity. He particularly focused on those who seemed vulnerable, perhaps lacking confidence, maybe struggling financially. In other words, he had a predator's instinct for identifying those most likely to trust him. The initial contact was always innocent, professional, friendly. "I love your look," he might write. I think you'd be perfect for a project I'm working on." He would spend weeks, sometimes months, building trust, asking about their goals, their dreams, offering encouragement, and what seemed like genuine opportunities. But every conversation, every friendly message, every word of encouragement was calculated, because Matthew Falder wasn't interested in helping anyone achieve their dreams. He was interested in turning those dreams into nightmares, and by the time his victims realized what was happening, they were already trapped in a web so sophisticated that escape seemed impossible. Falder's transformation from helpful photographer to blackmailer followed a pattern so precise it was almost algorithmic. First came the trust-building phase, weeks or months of seemingly genuine interest in his victim's career. Then came the request. "I'd love to do a test shoot with you," he would say, "just to see how you photograph." The requests started innocent enough, standard modeling poses, perhaps some artistic shots. But there was always a progression, always an escalation. "The client wants something a bit more edgy," he would claim. Or, "This particular campaign requires a more intimate feel." Each request pushed boundaries just slightly further than the last. And when victims complied, thinking they were building a professional portfolio, they were actually providing Falder with ammunition. Because the moment someone sent him compromising images, the helpful photographer disappeared. In his place emerged the blackmailer, cold, calculating, merciless. "Send me more," the messages would read. Or, "I'll share what you've already given me with everyone you know." What investigators would later discover was staggering in its scope. Falder wasn't just targeting people in his local area, or even just in Britain. His victims spanned continents: the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia. He had created an international web of exploitation, all managed from his quiet apartment in England. For nearly 8 years, from 2009 to 2017, this digital predator operated with virtual impunity. But what Falder didn't realize was that the same technology that had allowed him to hide in the shadows would eventually drag him into the light. Because in the digital age, nothing truly disappears. And someone, somewhere, was keeping track of every message, every threat, every moment of cruelty he had inflicted. The hunt for one of Britain's most prolific online predators was about to begin, and when it did, it would reveal a level of systematic abuse that would shock even the most experienced investigators. Stay with me as we uncover how Falder's victims fought back, how international law enforcement agencies joined forces, and how one man's digital footprints would ultimately lead to his downfall. Because sometimes, justice comes not from the streets, but from the servers. The first thing you need to understand about Matthew Falder's victims is that they weren't random. They were chosen, carefully selected after hours of digital stalking, psychological profiling, and calculated manipulation. Each one represented a different thread in what investigators would later call the most sophisticated web of online abuse they had ever encountered. Sarah was 17 when she first received a message from what appeared to be a legitimate modeling scout. Living in a small town in Pennsylvania, she dreamed of becoming a professional photographer herself. The message seemed like a miracle. Someone had noticed her amateur portfolio and wanted to help her build a professional one. For 3 months, the conversations were everything Sarah had hoped for: professional advice, technical tips, encouragement about her future. The person on the other end of the screen seemed genuinely invested in her success. They knew about lighting, composition, industry standards. They seemed real. Then came the first request. Just a simple portrait, they said. Something that shows your range as a subject, not just as a photographer. Sarah complied. It seemed reasonable, professional even. But within hours of sending that first image, everything changed. The friendly mentor disappeared. In their place was someone cold, demanding, threatening. "I need more," the messages read. And if you don't send them, I'll make sure everyone in your town sees what you've already given me. Your parents, your school, your friends, everyone. Sarah's story wasn't unique. In fact, as investigators would later discover, it was disturbingly common. Across the Atlantic, in Manchester, England, 19-year-old James received a similar message. This time, Falder was posing as a fitness photographer, targeting young men interested in modeling for health and wellness campaigns. James was studying to become a personal trainer. The opportunity seemed perfect. Professional photos for his portfolio, potential networking connections, maybe even paid work. Like Sarah, he spent months building what he thought was a professional relationship. Like Sarah, he discovered too late that he was actually building his own prison. What made Falder particularly dangerous wasn't just his initial deception. It was his understanding of psychology. He knew exactly how to escalate his demands gradually, ensuring that by the time victims realized they were being blackmailed, they felt too compromised to seek help. Each complied request made the next refusal seem impossible. One victim later described it as psychological quicksand. The more you struggled to get out, the deeper you sank. Falder would alternate between threats and false compassion. "I know this is hard," he would write, "but once we have what we need, this will all be over. Just one more photo, and you'll never hear from me again." But it was never just one more photo. For some victims, the abuse continued for years. Falder had created a system so efficient, so psychologically devastating, that many victims preferred to comply rather than risk exposure. They became prisoners in their own lives, constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering who might know their secret. While Falder believed he was operating in complete anonymity, every click, every message, every digital transaction was leaving traces, invisible to him, but not to the right investigators with the right tools. And unbeknownst to him, those investigators were already starting to pay attention. Falder's digital empire extended far beyond simple blackmail. Under his primary alias, In the Garden, he had become a central figure in some of the internet's most disturbing communities. He didn't just create illegal content, he traded it, distributed it, and helped others do the same. His operation was remarkably sophisticated. He used multiple layers of encryption, bounced communications through various proxy servers, and maintained dozens of different online identities. To casual observers, In the Garden appeared to be just another anonymous username in the digital crowd. But within these criminal communities, he had built a reputation. Other users looked up to him, sought his advice, treated him as a leader. He had achieved a twisted form of celebrity status among the worst people the internet had to offer. The international scope of his operation was staggering. Evidence would later show that he had victims in at least 8 countries across 4 continents. He had collaborators in Germany, customers in Australia, and victims everywhere in between. His digital web spanned the globe, connecting the darkest corners of multiple nations. What Falder didn't understand was that digital footprints are like DNA, unique, permanent, and impossible to completely erase. Every image he manipulated contained metadata. Every message he sent created logs. Every transaction left traces. He thought he was invisible, but he was actually creating the most detailed record of criminal activity investigators had ever seen. His choice of platforms also worked against him. The forums he used, the encryption he relied on, the proxy servers he trusted, all of them kept records. And while individual pieces of evidence might seem meaningless, when combined with advanced analytical software, they began to paint a picture. More damaging still were his habits. Falder was methodical, almost obsessive about record-keeping. He cataloged his victims, ranked his content, maintained detailed correspondence logs. He was creating his own prosecution case file without realizing it. Investigators would later discover that his digital activity followed predictable patterns. He was more active during university holidays, his posting times correlated with UK time zones, and his writing style, even when trying to disguise it, contained unique linguistic fingerprints. The irony was profound. A man who made his living studying the hidden structures beneath the Earth's surface was completely blind to the hidden structures of his own digital presence. Every move he made was being recorded, cataloged, and stored by systems he thought he understood but actually knew nothing about. The first report came in October 2013. A 17-year-old in Minnesota contacted local police about an online blackmailer who had been threatening her for months. The officer who took the report couldn't have known he was documenting the first thread that would eventually unravel one of the most extensive online crime operations in history. But that first report highlighted the enormous challenges facing law enforcement in the digital age. The victim was in Minnesota. The server hosting the illegal content appeared to be in Romania. The blackmailer's IP address bounced through proxies in 3 different countries. And the actual perpetrator? He could be anywhere. Traditional policing is built around geography. Crimes happen in specific locations, under specific jurisdictions, governed by specific laws. But cybercrime laughs at borders. A criminal in England could victimize someone in Australia, using servers in Eastern Europe, while breaking laws in a dozen different countries simultaneously. As more reports began filtering in from different countries, a pattern slowly emerged. Similar methods, similar language patterns, similar escalation tactics. But connecting these dots required unprecedented cooperation between agencies that had never worked together before. The breakthrough came when specialist cybercrime units in 3 different countries began sharing intelligence. The FBI's Innocent Images National Initiative in the United States, the UK's National Crime Agency, and Europol's European Cybercrime Center started comparing notes. And what they found was alarming. They weren't dealing with multiple criminals using similar methods. They were dealing with one criminal operating on a scale they had never encountered before. The same linguistic patterns appeared in communications with victims across multiple continents. The same sophisticated technical knowledge. The same psychological manipulation techniques. The technical challenges were immense. Falder was using military-grade encryption, constantly changing his online identities, and employing counter-surveillance techniques that were more sophisticated than many nation-states. He seemed to understand digital forensics better than some of the investigators trying to catch him. For months, international teams worked around the clock, following digital breadcrumbs through the darkest corners of the internet. They faced a suspect who seemed to be always one step ahead, who anticipated their methods and adapted his techniques faster than they could counter them. But criminals, no matter how smart they think they are, make mistakes. And in early 2016, Matthew Falder made his first serious error. It was small, a single technical oversight in how he routed a communication, but it was enough to give investigators their first real lead. That one mistake led to another clue, which led to another pattern, which led to a possibility that hadn't been considered before. What if their international criminal mastermind wasn't hiding in some cybercrime hub in Eastern Europe? What if he was hiding in plain sight, in one of the most respectable places on Earth? The idea seemed almost impossible. This level of technical sophistication, this depth of criminal knowledge, this complete lack of empathy, it seemed incompatible with the world of academic research. But as investigators dug deeper into the digital evidence, one possibility kept rising to the surface. By the spring of 2017, international law enforcement had narrowed their search to a handful of suspects in the UK. The net was closing, but they had to be absolutely certain. Because when you're about to arrest someone for crimes this serious, someone whose public reputation is completely at odds with their suspected private behavior, you get exactly one chance to get it right. After 4 years of investigation across multiple continents, After following digital evidence through the darkest corners of the internet, after building the most complex cybercrime case in British history, law enforcement was finally ready to strike. But what they would find when they knocked on Matthew Falder's door would exceed even their worst expectations. And here's something I want to ask you, because cases like this don't just happen in documentaries, they're happening right now. Have you ever received a suspicious message online? Something that seemed too good to be true? Drop a comment below and let me know, because your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs. And if you're finding this investigation as gripping as I do, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting to the moment where everything comes crashing down for Dr. Falder. And what happens next will absolutely shock you. May 2017. In a secure facility in Birmingham, England, Operation Cayenne had reached its critical phase. What started as individual reports from scattered victims had evolved into the largest international cybercrime investigation in British history. 37 investigators from 7 countries were now working around the clock, chasing digital shadows across the darkest corners of the internet. Detective Chief Inspector Jane Lloyd stood before a wall of evidence that told a story almost too horrific to believe. Hundreds of victims across multiple continents, thousands of illegal images, years of systematic psychological torture, and, at the center of it all, a single username: In the Garden. The breakthrough had come from an unlikely source: linguistic analysis software originally developed to identify terrorist communications. The program had detected consistent patterns in the language used across different platforms, different personas, different years. Whoever In the Garden was, he had a distinctive digital fingerprint that technology was finally sophisticated enough to recognize. The trail led investigators to academic institutions across the UK. The technical knowledge required for Falder's operation suggested someone with advanced computer skills and regular access to high-speed internet. The timestamps on his activities correlated with university schedules. His periods of reduced activity matched academic conference dates and holiday periods. By early June, the list had been narrowed to 12 suspects. Each was placed under discreet surveillance, while digital forensics teams worked to eliminate possibilities. The investigators knew they would get only one chance. Arresting the wrong person could alert the real perpetrator and destroy years of evidence. June 15, 2017. At 4:17 a.m., digital forensics specialist Sarah Chen made the call that would change everything. A sophisticated traffic analysis program had finally traced a communication back to its source. Not through the dark web, not through encrypted channels, through the Cambridge University network. The signal was coming from faculty housing adjacent to the Department of Earth Sciences, from an apartment registered to Dr. Matthew David Falder, lecturer in geophysics, Cambridge PhD, published researcher, and, according to 4 years of international investigation, one of the most prolific online predators in criminal history. The contrast was so stark it seemed impossible. Dr. Falder's academic record was spotless. His teaching evaluations were excellent. His research was respected. He had no criminal history, no suspicious associations, no red flags of any kind. To every measure of normal assessment, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a brilliant, quiet academic, dedicated to his research. But the digital evidence was undeniable. While Falder was publishing papers about seismic imaging during the day, he was orchestrating some of the most systematic online abuse ever documented during the night. The same hands that wrote scholarly articles about geological formations were typing threats to teenagers across the globe. June 20th, 2017, 6:15 a.m. The quiet residential street near Cambridge University looked like any other morning. Early commuters heading to work, a few joggers taking advantage of the cool morning air, the peaceful rhythm of academic life beginning another day. But beneath the surface, One of the most carefully orchestrated arrests in cybercrime history was about to unfold. 32 officers from the National Crime Agency, local police, and international task forces had spent weeks planning every detail. They knew they were dealing with someone who understood technology better than most law enforcement officials. At exactly 6:20 a.m., Falder's apartment building was quietly surrounded. Specialists had already disabled internet access to prevent him from destroying evidence remotely. Digital forensics experts were standing by with equipment designed to preserve electronic evidence, even if he attempted to wipe his devices. The arrest team approached apartment 4B with the methodical precision of a military operation. They knew that inside those walls were potentially thousands of pieces of evidence that could make or break cases against not just Falder, but dozens of other criminals in his network. At 6:23 a.m., Detective Inspector Michael Roberts knocked on Matthew Falder's door and announced the words that would end 8 years of digital terrorism. Dr. Falder, you're under arrest on suspicion of multiple counts of blackmail, making and distributing indecent images, and computer misuse offenses. What they found inside Falder's apartment would exceed even the investigators' worst expectations. 7 computers, dozens of external hard drives, and sophisticated networking equipment that turned his home into a digital command center. But it was what was on those devices that would make seasoned investigators struggle to sleep for months. The initial data recovery revealed over 137,000 illegal images and videos. But that was just the beginning. Hidden beneath layers of encryption were detailed databases of victims, comprehensive blackmail materials, and evidence of an operation so systematic it resembled a criminal corporation more than individual predation. In custody, Falder initially maintained his innocence. He claimed to be the victim of identity theft, suggested that someone had hijacked his internet connection, proposed that the evidence had been planted. But his explanations crumbled under the weight of digital forensics that placed him personally behind every communication. The evidence was overwhelming. Metadata from images showed they had been processed on his personal computers. Writing style analysis matched communications to his academic emails. Even his psychological profile matched victim testimony about their abusers' behavior patterns. October 2017. Birmingham Crown Court. The case that would redefine how the British legal system understood cybercrime was about to begin. But in a shocking turn that surprised even experienced prosecutors, Matthew Falder would never actually stand trial. Faced with evidence so comprehensive that denial was impossible, Falder's legal team advised him to plead guilty to all charges. On October 9, 2017, he formally admitted to 137 counts of abuse against 50 victims across multiple countries. But even these charges represented only a fraction of his actual criminal activity. The victim impact statements painted a picture of systematic psychological torture that had destroyed lives across the globe. A 19-year-old in Australia spoke of years of therapy and trust issues. A college student in America described how the blackmail had nearly driven her to suicide. A young man in Canada explained how he still couldn't form relationships 5 years after his ordeal ended. Judge Philip Parker QC faced an unprecedented challenge. British law had no clear precedent for someone who had committed crimes this extensive while never physically touching a single victim. How do you sentence someone whose weapons were psychological manipulation and digital technology? The prosecution argued that Falder's crimes were among the most serious non-violent offenses in British legal history. They emphasized the international scope, the systematic nature of his abuse, and the sophisticated technology he had used to avoid detection. They recommended the maximum possible sentence under existing law. The defense attempted to argue for leniency, citing Falder's previously clean record, his academic achievements, and his cooperation with the investigation. They suggested that his actions, while reprehensible, were committed by someone suffering from psychological disorders that diminished his responsibility. Judge Parker was unmoved. In his sentencing remarks, he described Falder's crimes as representing a new type of sexual offending made possible by the Internet. He noted that while Falder had never physically assaulted anyone, the psychological damage he had inflicted was immeasurable and permanent. On October 12, 2017, Matthew Falder received 32 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed for nonviolent crimes in British history. The judge specifically noted that Falder would serve a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole, ensuring he would be nearly 60 before potentially returning to society. As Falder was led away to begin his sentence, investigators were already using evidence from his computers to pursue dozens of other criminals in his network. His arrest had not just ended one man's reign of digital terror. It had opened the door to dismantling an entire international criminal ecosystem. But for the victims whose lives he had shattered, the sentence represented something more important than punishment. It represented validation, closure, and proof that even in the anonymous darkness of the Internet, justice could still find its way to the guilty. The Matthew Falder case had redefined cybercrime prosecution and set precedents that would influence Internet safety laws for years to come. But it also raised disturbing questions about how many other digital predators might be operating in plain sight, hiding behind respectable facades while destroying lives from the shadows. October 12, 2017, 2:47 p.m. Judge Philip Parker QC looked down at Matthew Falder and delivered words that would echo through courtrooms around the world. You have shown breathtaking arrogance and a total lack of empathy. You have wrecked the lives of many people, and you did so for no reason other than to satisfy your own warped desires. The sentence, 32 years in prison, sent shockwaves through the legal community. It was the longest sentence ever imposed for online-only offenses in British history, longer than many sentences for violent crimes, longer than some sentences for manslaughter. The message was clear. Digital crimes have real-world consequences. Legal experts called it a watershed moment. For the first time, a court had recognized that psychological torture delivered through a keyboard could be just as devastating as physical violence. The precedent would influence cybercrime sentencing, not just in Britain, but around the world. Falder was designated a Category A prisoner, the same classification reserved for terrorists and the most dangerous violent criminals. He would serve his sentence in isolation, with severely restricted internet access, and would be subject to monitoring for the rest of his life, even if eventually released. Outside the courthouse, victims' advocates hailed the sentence as validation that online abuse is real abuse, that digital crimes deserve serious punishment, and that survivors deserve justice regardless of whether their attacker ever touched them physically. Detective Chief Inspector Jane Lloyd, who had led the investigation, spoke to reporters with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. This sentence reflects the seriousness of Falder's crimes and the lasting impact on his victims. But it also represents just the beginning of our understanding of how to combat this type of criminality. The Falder case became a textbook study in digital predation, used by law enforcement agencies, educational institutions, and child safety organizations around the world. But perhaps more importantly, it revealed warning signs that everyone should recognize. Investigators identified the pattern that would become known as the Falder method: unsolicited contact from apparent professionals, gradual trust building over weeks or months, requests that slowly escalate in intimacy, and the sudden shift to blackmail once compromising material is obtained. Child safety experts emphasized that Falder's victims weren't naive or careless. They were targeted by someone who had spent years perfecting psychological manipulation techniques. The lesson isn't that people need to be more suspicious online, but that predators are becoming more sophisticated. Major tech companies implemented new safety features directly in response to the Falder case. Enhanced reporting mechanisms, improved detection algorithms for grooming behaviors, and automatic warnings for users receiving suspicious contact patterns. The investigation had also demonstrated the crucial importance of international cooperation in cybercrime cases. New protocols were established for sharing digital evidence across borders, streamlining what had previously been a months-long process into a matter of days. Universities began implementing mandatory digital safety training for students, recognizing that higher education environments, with their combination of young adults, high-speed internet, and academic freedom, were particularly vulnerable to sophisticated predators like Falder. Perhaps most importantly, the case led to expanded support services for victims of online abuse. New counseling programs specifically designed for digital trauma, legal aid services for cybercrime victims, and advocacy groups that understood the unique challenges of technological abuse. The evidence recovered from Falder's devices continued to generate prosecutions years after his arrest. By 2019, information from his network had led to arrests in 12 countries and the rescue of dozens of additional victims who were still being actively abused. Now, before we close out this case, I want to hear from you. Do you think 32 years was justice? Or should sentences for cybercrime be even harsher given the scale of victims affected? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This community always has incredible perspectives, and I read every single one. These conversations matter because they shape how we think about justice in the digital age. The story of Matthew Falder is ultimately a story about masks. Not the physical masks we wear, but the digital personas we create and the facades we maintain online. It's a reminder that in our hyper-connected world, the person on the other side of the screen might not be who they claim to be. But it's also a story about resilience, about victims who found the courage to come forward despite their fear and shame, about investigators who refused to give up despite the technical challenges, about a justice system that adapted to new realities and delivered real consequences for digital crimes. Today, as we share more of our lives online than ever before, the lessons of the Falder case remain urgent. Predators are still out there, still evolving their techniques, still looking for new ways to exploit trust and technology for their own twisted purposes. But we're not helpless. We're more aware of the warning signs, better equipped with reporting tools, and supported by law enforcement agencies that finally understand how to investigate digital crimes. The internet doesn't have to be a hunting ground for predators, but only if we remain vigilant. This has been another investigation from Cold Case Grim Files, where we explore the cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature and the brightest examples of justice prevailing. If stories like this one fascinate and educate you, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Because the digital age has created new types of crimes, and we'll be here to investigate every one of them. In the description below, you'll find links to digital safety resources, victim support services, and ways to report suspicious online behavior. Because sometimes, the most important story we can tell is how to protect yourself and others from becoming the next chapter. Until next time, remember, in a world where anyone can be anyone online, your best protection is knowledge, awareness, and the courage to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. This is Cold Case Grim Files, reminding you that justice might be slow, but it's also inevitable, especially when we all work together to make sure predators have nowhere left to hide.